I would argue that one of the key distinctions of 21st century politics, as opposed to post World War II politics and those during the Cold War, is the reemergence of populism as a major political force. Well, obviously, populism existed during the Cold War era because it's too useful a political tool to not make use of it. I would argue that it had kind of been relegated to the background to a certain extent, and there was a widespread fear, at least among the elites, of employing populism or it becoming too major a part of the political process. I think a lot of that comes down to a lot of most communist and fascistic regimes come about from some sort of populism, from some sort of loss of legitimacy of the existing elite and the desire for a total societal transformation to restore government to the people, as it were. And I would also argue that liberal democracy is kind of antithetical to populism to more of an extent than really fascism is or communism is. But that being said, I think even within the communist regimes in the Eastern Bloc, as soon as they were established, populism became a big no-no. It was kind of a fear, partially because in most of the Eastern Bloc, the regimes were backed up by the Soviet army, and they were not at all popular with the people. So they were this elite that was being put up by a foreign power, and they didn't really want to touch the elite in their society because they were the elite in their society. Um, and I guess they could try to portray the West as being the great Satan, but there wasn't really the same way you could do it within the context of the one country. Mao also ran into this issue, and while he did eventually organize his own form of populism as a way of destroying all of his political rivals, for a long time he was very skeptical and afraid of it because of the horrific things that were going on in China. And if anyone tried to start thinking of the needs of the people or the interests of the people rather than the interests or the needs of the Chinese state or the interests or needs of Mao personally, people would start asking bad questions like how the Great Leap Forward was actually helping China. And generally speaking, when anyone asked those questions, they tended to disappear or meet unfortunate accidents. But in the 21st century, you're seeing populism emerge in most Western countries and even a lot of non Western countries. And I think before we kind of get more into this, let's kind of describe what populism, or rather define what populism is. So, there's a lot of different definitions. I'd say very much what I see at a very basic level, it's the defining of and the juxtapositioning of two fundamental groups in society, the elite and the people. Now, that's not to say there isn't other groups in society and there aren't citizens or residents or whatever who are not part of how they would define the people or the elites, like an underclass, like illegal immigrants, like the upper middle, some kind of other factions. But generally speaking, society is seen as there is an elite and there is the people. And part of populism is that the people are virtuous, they are good, they have moral value, they are the productive, admirable aspect of society, whereas the elite are corrupt, decadent, lawless, immoral, and greedy. Now, you could expand this a bit further and say it's not just an elite, it's whoever is really defined as being the other. And the other is usually the elite, but depending on the type of populism we're talking about, the people you're going up against may not even necessarily be an elite, they just might be not part of the group that's defined as the people. So that's a very broad description of populism. And what can get kind of confusing is there's left wing, there's right wing, there's centrist, there's non spectrum forms of populism. There's forms of populism that target the middle class, that target the working class, that target the underclass. Some that are more geared towards, the elite or whatever. There's a whole bunch of different forms of populism, some of them racial, some of them economic, some of them religious. And it's how can you fit all these different things within this one category? And I'd say the general difference between right-wing populism, left-wing populism, whatever type of populism you want to talk about, is how the people are defined and how the elite or the other is defined. So maybe starting off with what's generally seen as the most common form of populism, although ironically it doesn't really exist anymore. It's employed by people on the right more so. Economic populism, or I guess you could say older left-wing populism. So under this model, the people is the working class. Now, the definition of the working class can matter. It could be people who are within the socioeconomic category working class, which is people below the middle class but still work for a living, who aren't necessarily the poorest people in society, but aren't, but they're like some sort of physical laborer who makes enough money to maybe have a house and a family, but is in a very precarious position where their employer has a lot of direct power over them. And they might constantly be on the verge of starvation or on the edge of financial ruin. Some I guess you could say left-wing populist movements might include the middle class, and you could especially see this in a lot of American ones and countries where you have a super rich, where the middle class is so much poorer than the elites, or however they're defining the elites, that it doesn't really matter. It's like the people in power make 500 times more money than a middle class person, as opposed to 1,000 times more money than a working class person, and they might be included within this. And so, kind of under this older left wing populism model, you'll have the people as being the working class, and there's normally a lot of moral dimensions applied to it. Now, it kind of depends upon what type of of leftism you're using, because even within what I call them the Communist Manifesto, they talk about the family and that sort of thing. So, like some of the older forms would say, oh, the working class have these strong, intact families. The working class are honest, hardworking people. They put their blood, sweat, and tears in. They're virtuous. They're not the ones who screw other people over to make money. They're more law-abiding than the elite. They don't hold wealth to the detriment of other people. There's often there's an inherent value in the work that they do. And I guess you get things like labor theory of value from that. And the bad guy in that situation, the elite, are capitalists, landowners, wealthy people in general, who are seen as, like I said, corrupt, immoral, producing inferior products, defrauding their workers, not providing safe conditions, something like that. And the traditional goals of left-wing populism is normally some either workers' rights or redistribution of wealth, or a push for greater democracy, which is used for the redistribution of wealth or additional rights and privileges for workers. So that's kind of what an older form of left-wing populism would be. Now, if we look at maybe a newer form of left-wing populism, it tends to portray minorities, be it sexual minorities, racial minorities, or religious minorities. They're defined as the people, or they're defined as the virtuous group. And what you would consider the native population, or the population that existed as the overwhelming majority prior to the introduction of these groups, is considered to be the elites or the bad guys. So you have an interesting situation which the elites in some countries can be up to 70 to 80% of the population, whereas the people are like 10% of the population. And kind of an example of this is if you have a black guy who's tall, good-looking, athletic, comes from a wealthy family, is intelligent, and then you have like a white guy who comes from a working-class family, he's not particularly bright, and he has some sort of accident, he's paraplegic. With regards to how the new left sees the situation, the wealthy black guy would be seen as the person, or the people, and the poor disabled white guy would be seen as the elite. And it's kind of interesting, and I think you can say that with a lot of not just left-wing populism, but just how neoliberalism looks at the world in general, is there's kind of this weird inversion. I'm not sure if you would call it elitism or whatever, but neoliberalism seems to openly despise populism. It despises any kind of concept of the people in favor of a global culture in which you're governed by a global elite who don't have any particular loyalties to countries or religions or ideologies. There's kind of this vague like I said, the one world government. Everything needs to kind of, or not even one world government, but everything is just needs to be based off of making money and that sort of thing. So you have stuff that's kind of the newer form of left wing populism. Now, if we get into right wing populism, I don't know how people want to classify libertarianism. I'm kind of hesitant always to put it as a right wing ideology, but like I said, you can combine populism with just about anything. So, libertarian populism generally will pit the person who works for a living, the person who owns their own business, the entrepreneur, the person who's trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps as the people or the good guy. And the bad guy is, generally speaking, government. That is, the fundamental problem of society is that government has been placed above the individual or the entrepreneur, in that there needs to be some sort of showdown in which government is defeated and power and wealth, etc., are restored to the entrepreneur or to the individual. And in a lot of time in America, this sort of conservative libertarianism comes across as a sort of middle class populism, which I'd say was also kind of prevalent during the American Revolution. The idea being citizens, kind of almost like a Roman sense, property owners who own houses or businesses or are kind of middle income, are the constituent group of American society. You can see this in how much people talk about the middle class. We have to preserve the middle class. We have to preserve families in the middle class. There's kind of a fetishization of people in the middle income as it being the ideal group to be in. And almost there's kind of a implicit idea that people either have to be brought up to the middle class or brought down to the middle class, and that should just be society. I mean, I've known people who've called themselves middle class populists in the past, and they view their goal as basically trying to achieve a middle class standard of living for everybody within society. And then we get into right wing forms of populism. Now, once again, there's a whole variety of these. Probably the most common would be some sort of national populism or nationalistic populism, in which the people are defined as the nation being the cultural, biological, historical, often kind of religious, basically just the identity of the people who founded the country and make up the country are viewed as the people, and those who seek to undermine that or come in and influence it as being the elite or being the bad guy. And this is kind of where the whole immigration narrative comes from. Is right-wing populists will be against Islamic immigrants, because as a necessary aspect of bringing in religious diversity, religious toleration laws get passed. If there's any sort of state religion, it gets disestablished. And the people who live there have to fundamentally change their value system and their lifestyle to accommodate this. And to them, the in group is, like I said, the people who live in the country. And you could almost kind of consider, a lot of them kind of consider immigrants as almost constituting an elite or being a tool of the elite, because they often will get a lot of legal protections and welfare benefits and stuff, like affirmative action, that the native population does not enjoy. Like in a lot of countries, Muslims can say stuff that about gays or Jews or whatever with no consequences. And if anyone else says something vaguely like that, they would go to jail. And there's like the case in America with the Fort Hood shooter, where they called it workplace violence and they refused to call it a terrorist attack. And that's just the kind of thing that you will frequently see. And so there's often a belief that these people are a sort of elite, even if they might be poor. So like a lot of illegal Hispanic immigrants are poor, but they're immune from basic laws that you and I aren't immune to. Like, they don't have to pay taxes. There's a lot of regulations they don't have to comply with. The fact that they're even in the country is illegal. If you or I tried to do something like that, we get arrested. So they are kind of an elite in the sense that they have extrajudicial, they're above the law. The same thing with someone like Black Lives Matter. Even if a lot of Black Lives Matter and Antifa are kind of drawn from the lumpen proletariat or kind of the dregs of society, They constitute an elite by the fact that they're able to loot, riot, burn, and stuff and kill people with no consequences. They have a huge legal superiority over the average person. So even if maybe their economic wealth isn't there, they do kind of constitute an elite. They also have a disproportionate amount of influence over the government, as they can basically get whatever they want, whereas what I guess I would, or the right wing would define as the people, have no ability to do that. So you can have this in a racial sense. So like in a racial sense, it would be, you don't want, I don't know, if you're like China, they stir up anger against black immigrants. Particularly, that was one of the causes of Tiananmen Square, was Mao tried hard to bring in a whole bunch of African students, and that pissed the Chinese people off. And kind of appealing to xenophobia in China is always a good way to drum up some public support. So it can come from kind of a racial angle. That's also what a lot of segregationists were like in the South. There's a religious angle that could be something maybe like in, I'm not sure if this ever really was the case in Ireland, but maybe in a country like Ireland, anger towards a Protestant minority, as they're seen as subversive and interfering with the natural rule of the country, kind of like how the Huguenots were thought of within France. Or maybe a better example would be how Catholics were viewed in the United States, because the fear was that Catholics would just vote however the Pope told them to vote, and that they'd constitute this unique bloc whose purpose would be kind of to be subverting the existing power structure in favor of a foreign power. So even people who weren't necessarily devout would still identify with Protestantism and view America as being a Protestant country. You can have more of a cultural approach that's not really racial, but the idea is that immigrants have to, or immigrants or people within the country, become part of the people by adopting the culture and values. That is, identifying, like in the case of America, identifying as America, following the Constitution, revering the Founding Fathers, believing in freedom, e pluribus unum, all that kind of stuff. Is you're part of the people if you do that, and you're not part of the people, or you're an enemy of the people if you don't hold to that opinion. And then there's all kinds of other forms. It's pretty easy to come up with some, like environmentalism. You can have environmentalist populism, where the elites are raping the environment for their own benefit, while at the same time they're denying the access to these critical resources, both for us and for our children, through their irresponsible use of it. It helps if one group has a sense of power, but that's not necessarily the case, because it can be employed by people who are in the position of privilege or the position of authority against the people who don't. And you can see this a lot with the appeals made by companies in the US, where you'll get big banks and social media giants who will define themselves as the people, and as like the users they ban as being the elites. And you kind of, once again, you can kind of see this with Black Lives Matter or Antifa or other groups that receive immense amounts of money from the most powerful people in the country, viewing themselves as the underdog and trying to channel populist sentiment against the people who they view as the elite. People like Nick Fuentes, who basically fund their operation off of super chat donors rather than receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from companies like Bank of America. So I hope that kind of explained populism. I hope you found the video interesting. God bless, and talk to everybody again real soon.